What is it actually that makes a job difficult to learn and play in Final Fantasy XIV? Naturally, it is often a subjective thing, but somehow most can agree that Summoner is shockingly easy, while jobs like Black Mage or even Gunbreaker tend to be considered rather difficult. In this video, I will go over a few common factors that can cause a job to be difficult, and I would love to hear in the comments what kind of things make a job difficult for you to pick up or even master. Before I get started, I just want to point out that most of the hardest jobs in the game are the hardest because they have multiple of the factors that make a job difficult. That is to say that for some of the factors, you might see me list jobs that are not actually considered super difficult by most because they only have one of these factors really pronounced, which usually isn't enough. Now, the first thing that can cause a job to be very difficult is an overwhelming amount of oGCDs. I have a 1-minute short on the subject. Often, this causes jobs that are otherwise relatively straightforward in the lower levels to become overwhelming in the later levels of the job. Dragoon and Bard are great examples of this, as both of their rotations are quite simple for the first many levels. But as they both get more tools, the order of cooldowns can become difficult to manage, and because both have multiple damage buffs, fitting everything within that strict time frame becomes crucial. Ninja and Astrologian are two other great examples, with specifically Astrologian having such an overwhelming amount of oGCDs that it is the primary reason a lot of players point to when talking about its difficulty. What groups Ninja and Astrologian together is that their oGCDs are mostly clustered in their bursts, leaving large empty areas in their rotations. Meanwhile, both Dragoon and Bard, while having large clusters of cooldowns in bursts, also have regular cooldowns that need to be managed, like Geistgagul, Jump, dot timers and song management, which means you never can completely relax at any point in your rotation. Both Dark Knight and Gunbreaker also get somewhat honorable mentions on this one, because they also have a lot of oGCDs to manage. However, the sheer magnitude of them are slightly reduced to compensate for them being tanks. It is still a core reason why they are considered the more difficult tanks though. The second thing that can cause a job to be very difficult is higher speed rotations due to faster GCDs, like Monk, Machinist, Ninja and Samurai, since you are forced to make decisions faster, leading to more chances for mistakes. Ninja and Samurai greatly compensate for this by having long periods of downtime between the high-speed bursts, and Machinists mostly only go super fast during hypercharge. Machinists do, however, have a lot of things to consider for each GCD, which can give the illusion that the rotation is going a lot faster than it actually is. However, the Monk is probably the poster child for speedy rotations. Every GCD technically presents at least 2 options, and you also need to keep track of cooldowns and the chakra resource. On top of this, where you are in your combo rotation has a direct impact on how you should approach your burst, meaning that you may need to plan ahead with the limited thinking time you have between your GCDs. The difficulty of keeping track of the Monk GCD rotation alone led to not only the discovery of the inferior Dragon Kick rotation, but the fact that some players use it anyway, because it is viewed as easier. In reality, the Monk GCD rotation isn't too complex, and making a mistake isn't too costly outside of perfect balance, so the speed of the rotation itself is a key factor in the sheer difficulty of the job. The third thing that can cause a job to be very difficult is unpredictable rotations, with Bard being a common example for this with its split opener with 2 different paths depending on random chance. Combine this with Bloodletter and especially Pitch Perfect requiring sudden reaction from the player lest you risk losing out on potential damage. Black Mage is also a great example of this, as both Thundercloud and Firestarter procs can have a profound effect on precisely how your rotation plays out for each pull. Meaning that unlike jobs with more rigid rotations, where you can predict exactly where you are 2 minutes in, a Black Mage may have to get creative if they want to be absolutely sure they are in a specific part of their fire phase for raid buffs consistently. This is further compounded by the transpose line tricks. Dancer and Red Mage are also both jobs that are known for their somewhat unpredictable and random rotations. Random procs are a core component of both of their rotations after all. However, while this feature can make them both difficult to learn and pick up for some players, it is not considered a particularly problematic part of mastering the jobs. An honorable mention goes to Monk, not exactly because of randomness, but rather because the slightest delay in the rotation can completely alter how the Monk has to approach its burst, which somehow gives a similar feeling to an actually unpredictable rotation. The fourth thing that can cause a job to be very difficult is when small mistakes can be incredibly costly. Naturally, a mistake is likely to lose you damage as any job, but there is a world of a difference between the kinds of mistakes a summoner can typically make compared to, say, a black mage, not to mention the impact of said mistakes. The best examples, in my opinion, of jobs with this difficulty are Ninja and Black Mage, with Ninja having the capacity to mess up ninjutsus and completely fizzle GCDs, not to mention split-second mistakes can lead to using the wrong ninjutsus as well. Forgetting to plan Suiton in time can also cause a lot of trouble for the burst. For Black Mage, small mistakes can both lead to your Astral Fire just dropping entirely due to a greedy sequence or a miscalculation, which costs you in both having to restart your rotation, but also possibly costing you a polyglot just as icing on the cake. Of course, as you become more proficient with a job, this becomes less of an issue entirely, but it makes a job far more difficult to pick up in the first place when a single mistake can be ludicrously costly. Samurai and Dragoon can also fit here, as both of them rely on rather long combo sequences. Mixing up where you are in the sequence can be painful and difficult to fix once the damage is done, or rather, isn't done, you could say. I also feel that Gunbreaker is an honorable mention here, as while having a single GCD fall outside No Mercy isn't that big of a deal, depending of course on what the GCD is. In terms of what damage a Gunbreaker can lose from making mistakes, it is one of the big ones, and such an obvious mistake that it is a common pain point for the job itself, and a common reason why the job is considered so difficult: the strictness of the No Mercy window. The fifth thing that can cause a job to be very difficult are, simply put, complicated or outright unintuitive rotations. Monk is a great example of the unintuitive rotation, partly due to its unusually wide list of options to start their rotation with, combined with the many different ways you can approach the perfect balance cooldown, with a few of them being intentionally marked as incorrect in a similar fashion to Ninja's Black Mage Bunny, although not as punishing. In a similar fashion, Machinist also has a somewhat unintuitive rotation when you push the optimization to the limit, which, similar to Monk, leads to multiple openers with very slightly different use cases. But that doesn't consider the fact that what is considered optimal for Machinist is somewhat weird, even for what is normally expected of optimized rotations. For generally complicated rotations, I would again suggest Black Mage and Ninja. For Black Mage, the general mission statement of getting as many fire spells out as possible is a lot more complicated than it sounds, since it also depends on how high in Astral Fire you are, and a lot of neat transpose related tricks can seem good in theory, but in practice it might just be a damage loss rather than a damage gain at the end of the day anyway. For Ninja, there's both the preparation leading up to a burst, with preemptively setting up Suiton and Kasatsu, but also more minute details such as how to prioritize your actions, which tends to get simplified to a simple set sequence because the speed of the burst, as mentioned earlier, simply doesn't leave you the time to consider your options unless you know it intuitively. And the sixth thing that can cause a job to be very difficult to even pick up is overwhelming information. This one tends to be more common with jobs that start at higher level, with both Sage, Samurai and Red Mage standing out as great examples of this. Samurai with its difficult to memorize action names, Red Mage with its dual casting mechanic that isn't as immediately intuitive as you'd think for some players, and then Sage, who introduces essentially what amounts to Scholar's Toolkit, but starting at level 70. Overwhelming many players not used to the healing rule, and even some that are, right out the gate. In all three cases, it's either too many things to learn or a complicated component of their toolkit. A fourth great example of this, however, is what we tend to refer to as the easiest job in the game: Summoner. Now, Summoner is a very easy job to play, because its rotation is very rigid, yet also very flexible, and can often be boiled down to click the shiny button if you really want to simplify. But if you actually sit down to try and understand why you do what, you will be met with tooltips like this colossus. If you are acquainted with how the job works, all this text intuitively turns into damage, 2 ruby rights, double book smack, and everything else sort of just fades out from the tooltip. But if you don't know that, then simply understanding this line requires you to read the Gemshine tooltip separately. And that doesn't explain it either, so you have to go and look for what action it actually turns into to understand it. And if you are low level, this is further confused by the fact that Ruby Ruin 1, 2 and 3 don't exist in your actions and traits at all. Obviously, you could just click the buttons and see what happens, but some players learn by reading the tooltips, and that is where a job with overwhelming amounts of information can become too difficult to pick up. However, we can probably agree that this single factor isn't really enough to make a job hard to play. And of course, the seventh and final thing I want to bring up that can cause a job to be difficult to play for some players is when the job is too easy, so they fall asleep trying to play it. Two really common examples of jobs that are made impossibly difficult by this problem are Warrior and Summoner, although some players would have you think it applies to all jobs. That is to say that all of these reasons I have listed throughout this video might not apply to everyone, and some players find Black Mage to be the easiest job in the game, and others find Summoner impossible because the tooltips are too confusing. What makes jobs difficult to play varies from player to player, and some find all of it very approachable, and other times you might just discover that the reason you think a job is super easy is because you forgot a crucial component of the job that actually makes it hard. Even jobs that I didn't mention in this video can be difficult in their own way, they simply didn't present as great examples of specific difficulties. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can make sure to let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, Black Mage and Monk tends to be the jobs that people agree are the hardest, of course, aside from some of those that main the jobs. Yet, they both have vastly different difficulties. Monk, when perfected, plays a mostly perfectly predictable, strict rotation at a really high pace, while Black Mage plays a very varied and flexible rotation at a much slower pace, which really underlines that neither option necessarily is the more difficult one.